The three things that I'm kind of looking at from that are, one, that we want to win the race to fill the flex. Two, that we want to build as talented a team as possible. And three, we want to build a team that is best constructed to manage, to weather, and even to benefit from the chaos of the NFL season.
The misconceptions of zero RB, a decade on from the inception, more than a decade at this particular point in time. It's myself, Colm Kelly. I'm joined by Shawn, Siegele, the man who penned the article on RotoViz.com. We are going to talk through some of the misconceptions that still arise and how those misconceptions maybe have changed over the years. We are now in 2025. We had a great show looking at zero RB in 2025 with Eric Bindford of Spike Week a couple of weeks back, and we posted that as well on the RotoViz channel. We got a lot of positive feedback to that, but I think it's a fun conversation to dive into as we enter July. We get closer to the season, and the topic of conversation continues to kind of change, but there's always little bits of nuance. It's very hard to add to that conversation when it's in a social media environment. But Shawn, how are you feeling, and how are you set up as we're ramping up here towards the NFL season? We even had a big trade. We may not dive into it, but a big trade with Jonnu Smith heading over to the Pittsburgh Steelers just before we recorded. But how are you to start off your week here?
Good. Yeah, we have the fourth coming. That's going to be very exciting for us and most of our listeners. Once we get through the excitement and enjoyment of that holiday, then Colm, as you mentioned, will be closing in. And yet at the same time, we still have a good month-ish amount of time here to really calibrate properly for what will then happen once we hit training camp, right? We'll get a flurry of news. We'll have puff pieces every day. We'll have, this guy's looking great. This guy is maybe not in the role that we thought, even though what happens in practice is going to be a little bit different than what happens when you get out there in the first preseason games, when you get out there in the regular season. Obviously, practice has specific goals that those teams are trying to accomplish. But before we get into the maelstrom, one of the things that we want to make sure that we use this next month to do is to understand the players, where they are at before all of that movement starts. Because how you react to the movement is a little bit irrelevant if you have the players in the wrong place to start with. Then on top of that, we can work through things like, Colm, what you and I are going to talk about today, which is, what are the best structures that, at least at these prices, we know prices are going to move some, but frankly, there have been so many drafts already, and there'll be so many drafts in the next month that with the current fantasy environment, we're probably going to see more minimal moves. Now, you're going to have some individual players who either skyrocket or plummet, but generally, drafters are going to be reluctant to give up on the prices that they've already paid, the beliefs that they already have. And so we've got a pretty good sense of what 2025 drafting is going to look like. We want to make sure we work through what structures are going to give us the best chance, and Colm, probably ideally creating more than one way to attack it. We want to create as many paths as we can through our structure, and then figure out how to maximize the value of our player selections through those types of ideas.
And I guess that's kind of maybe a point to start off. I often think that, there needed to be a name for people to, have the conversation about the draft strategy. And obviously it's zero RB, but I do think that a lot of the information and a lot of the detail behind it then gets lost to a lot of people from that point forward, in terms of like being a case of like not having a running back through a certain amount of rounds, rather than the entire process of what we're trying to do with the draft strategy. Because for people who have been RotoViz Overtime or RotoViz consumers over the years and have watched this draft or read your articles and looked at drafts, there'll be a multitude of different ways that we end up with certain teams, but there's a massive amount of crossover between the core principles of like creating those rosters and those, like, I guess if you want to say a draft strategy, but basically drafting teams that you think are going to have a high upside with hopefully an optimal roster construction with a chance to win, and being able to adapt to those in draft rooms. I think, I'll joke with people and people will probably joke with us, but it's not a case of just like hating running backs and never want to draft running backs and having to wait to 10 rounds into the draft. But I do think the sometimes people find it hard to see past that. I've talked on a few shows recently. We talked about it with Eric about in BBM last year, over 20% of the teams being 0 RB drafted rosters, and Tom Strachan dived in some further to that on social media over the last couple of days. But like looking into the core concepts of how many of those teams had a running back, after round 5, how many of them drafted in round 5, how many was in round 6, but how those teams then looked, when it got to 10 rounds or 15 rounds. I think a lot of it just is put into a box of like 5 rounds, for example, or 4 rounds with no running back. Hayden Winks has posted an article on Underdog over the last week, which I thought was pretty interesting as well, using some of the information there that I mentioned from Tom. But what are some of the areas, I guess, when you think of like the article you wrote 12 years ago at this particular point, and were like some of the bits that people still miss all this time later? Obviously, fantasy has evolved immensely in that time, but there is still, I think, some very key areas that are overlooked based on the fact that they're like, those guys just don't draft running backs.
So when you pitched this concept again, when we had talked about it, in several different ways recently, part of me was thinking, I don't even know.
Again?
Yeah. Part of me was thinking again. Part of me was thinking, I don't even know that I would be pushing 0 RB very hard in 2025. I don't know that it's a great fit for the shape of the positions, the likely scoring. It maybe doesn't allow you to take advantage of some things that are out there this year. Now, having said that, it also occurred to me that there probably are still plenty of very exploitable opportunities for 0 RB or for what we're trying to accomplish. And I was thinking about ways that we could either communicate the original concepts or articulate the most important elements of it today, maybe some, hybrid version of that. Think back to the original article. Anytime I do go back and read it, I'm a little bit surprised by, now we have all of these, 4, 5, 6, 12,000 word articles. It's a short piece that I think does communicate some principles that will really help you. And when I'm looking at it for both the big picture, but also then 2025, there are 3 basic things that come to mind that both arise out of those principles from way back then, but also are very important as we think about how we want to win leagues, either this year or any year. The 3 things that I'm kind of looking at from that are, 1, that we want to win the race to fill the flex. 2, that we want to build as talented a team as possible. And 3, we want to build a team that, I don't exactly want to say benefits from, although that is kind of part of the original piece. Certainly, even in the original piece, I made this pretty big digression and said, look, we're not rooting for players to get hurt, right? But a team that is best constructed to manage, to weather, and even to benefit from the chaos of the NFL season. So we're thinking flex, talent, and chaos. And one of the things that, made me think that we probably are not really emphasizing those principles correctly. And not that everybody has to, right? Not everybody has to draft 0 RB. Not everybody who wants to go wide receiver heavy also wants it to be sort of from 0 RB principles, right? And that's one reason why, when you think about, at different points in time, a lot of people have said through the years, well, it would have been less controversial and more accurate if the name had just been something to the effect of wide receiver heavy. And mostly I've gone along with that. I think there's a lot of truth to that. One of the things that really jumped out at me from the most recent MFL 10 of Death column that you and I did, several shows on last week, was that the team that in many ways I think is the most similar to Zero RB is JJ's team, where he selected Ashton GT in round 1. And so if you're like, okay, if that's Zero RB, then it kind of invalidates everything about it, because it's obviously a running back foundation team. But here's my thought on it.
Again, that's where I think again it gets lost, as people are like, it can't be. But we're drafting more on the principles of how to build the team rather than it can't be a running back. A lot of the good stuff over the last couple of years, Michael Dubner's talked about it a few times here on the RotoViz airwaves and written about it. That 5 wide receivers through 7. It doesn't have to be, 5 wide receivers through 5 rounds. Trying to build out your team in that way rather than getting the perception of the strategy is that it's like a locked in your ways. It's the only way it can be done, which I think, again, as we go through the evolution is and wide receiver heavy, as you mentioned with the name fitting, may not have had the same traction, Shawn. That is the other part of it.
But I've kind of gotten back to the point, or made the full journey all the way around to the idea that one of the reasons we didn't call it wide receiver heavy is because wide receiver heavy doesn't actually get it. If you look at the MFL 10 of Death draft board, one of the things that you do notice is that it generally follows what we're seeing in 2025, where it is relatively wide receiver heavy.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, if you look at the individual teams, with an emphasis on the teams that are wide receiver heavy, and I want to caveat this right out the start by saying, in no way am I saying that those teams won't win or that my team is better. We're always going to be in favor of our own team, and you should like your own team. That's the team that you drafted. If you didn't win the draft based off drafting on your own draft board, then you really had some problems, right? But my point would be that the wide receiver heavy teams have not actually accomplished what I would consider are the goals of Zero RB, which again, flex, talent, chaos. And one of the things that we're looking to do with Zero RB and with this build, and when I say talent, you have a variety of things there. Colm, I've written about it a bunch already this year. I've got several articles coming out in the next week and a half that will emphasize it some more. Blair's always doing work on it. The young receivers who are about to make the jump are still going to be undervalued because they haven't fully made the jump yet. There's a difference between taking those guys and simply taking players like a Keon Coleman, who were drafted early, probably don't fit the talent argument, and are simply non-breakouts to this point, right? But it's not just drafting young players. It's drafting players who maybe are unproven, but we have a lot of track record beyond the scoring at the NFL level that suggests these guys are really talented. And we're talking about Zero RB. The whole point is that you are drafting wide receivers in the range where wide receivers really give you bang for your buck. They really give you punch. And so when I say that JJ's team in some ways is the most similar, he has 6 wide receivers through 9. I drafted 6 through 9 and took a 7th in round 11 because it just absolutely made no sense that Luther Burden was still there. But he and I were the only 2 rosters that had 6 through 11. They had 6 through 9. Colm, you and I talked on the show with Eric about how 6 through 8, 6 through 9 was kind of the important point, because you're trying to get to this area of the draft where you have created the most possible talent by hitting on receivers there and then avoiding them. Now, JJ did end up taking a couple of additional receivers. That part you can look at in a variety of different ways. But essentially, the receivers from the Burden pick and probably really the Trey Harris pick there at the end of round 9, all the way to the end. Almost all of those you don't want because that decreases the overall talent on your team. And then when you look at this sort of stretch of running backs, even with the draft being wide receiver heavy, you don't have a lot of emphasis on running backs in the double-digit rounds, and you don't have a lot of emphasis on young running backs in the double-digit rounds. There were only 3 teams, I believe, who took a rookie running back in the double-digit rounds. And so when you are thinking about creating a team with the maximum amount of talent, there are specific ways that we know that you simply do that year in and year out. When you are into the 0 RB area of drafts, or you're looking at 0 RB candidates and you're drafting players who have already lost their jobs essentially because they didn't have NFL talent, and if a starter ahead of them gets hurt, they will not have the full role because they either are already not really even the backup, or they cannot hold off the third string back because they are not as talented as the third string back. That's a problem, right? And so when we think about flex, talent, and chaos, if you don't draft enough talent, you're also not going to benefit from the chaos, but you're also not going to have this ability to really hit the flex positions in a way that allows you, again, just to have the team that scores the most points. I mean, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to win. Saying that we have some type of fidelity or perfect fidelity to a type of structure or, a type of meme or what have you, that's not the goal. Right? We're trying to win.
Yeah.
And we want to make sure that everything we do that is 0 RB related is in the service of winning, not in the service of how does it fit into an online debate. Now, the online debates can help us hone our thoughts sometimes and understand where the strengths and weaknesses are. So certainly I'm not in any way saying that talking about these things or debating these things is a problem. We would just want to make sure that in the end, when we come back from it all, that we didn't try and beat someone on the internet. We tried to win fantasy leagues.
Yeah, and I think that is obviously the most important part. It is kind of that line of like, do you want to tell people where maybe they're going wrong drafting their teams, or do you want to just let people draft their teams wrong? Well, obviously we do a show where we try and set things up for the RotoViz OT community, so we want to help them to draft good, optimal teams. But realistically, the best thing would be like when I see people and there's like maybe an area where I'm like, maybe that's just not right. Maybe I should just say like, yeah, that you're do that because then obviously we'll be able to draft more optimal teams and maybe win some more dollars along the way. Shawn, the other parts that it comes into, and it is interesting, like, mentioned how long ago this was, but like the way that draft boards are set up now, if we had said in 2013 that look at this draft board, this is going to be your average draft in 2025, or especially last year when it became very, very heavily used, you'd be looking at it and you'd be like, this is not real. This isn't a real draft board, because it went from like so much reliance on the running back position and trying to make sure you have like 2 running backs through 2 rounds and building your team from that perspective. And it's been very running back heavy. And even if we get into quarterbacks, very quarterback heavy in those earlier rounds around the same time. So when you're like writing about this, and at the time it was Jimmy Graham and Rob Gronkowski, you mentioned about like through the opening 5 rounds having 1 tight end and 4 wide receivers. And that was obviously much easier to do back then because it was contrarian at the time and people weren't doing it. So you could do some of those objectives much, much easier. And as the way it has evolved and people are valuing wide receivers in a certain way and maybe not drafting running backs and making some of the errors that people would have made in the past. But the elite tight end concept is still very key to the way that we draft these teams. And it's something that gets, traction online as well, the elite tight end conversation. Whether it's 0 RB, hero RB, whatever type of draft we want to do you feel that and I kind of know the answer to this, but I'm going to, it's a leading question, Shawn. Do you feel that elite tight end still is a pivotal advantage when you're constructing any roster in 2025?
I think you want to know your format, right? And one of the things about this MFL 10 of death draft is that it wasn't very tight end heavy. There are a number of ways that you can look at that, because in some best ball scoring formats, there is an advantage to simply getting your team built really well and then having volume at tight end. That's something that shows up in the Underdog roster construction explorer. This is a full PPR format where I think that is less the case. We saw that in the old school MFL 10 of Death roster construction explorer. We've seen that in the actual results of this league, which, I mean, this league is just one individual league in one individual season every year. And so you want to keep in mind that a position like tight end is going to lend itself to positional analysis in a way that is weaker than running back and wide receiver for pretty obvious reasons. And yet, when you think about most formats, you think about the FFPC Best Ball format, tight end just across the board. Anytime that you have any question about what the right pick is, just go ahead and draft a tight end. And then when you get done with the draft, your team will be good, right? When we think about redraft, and one of the things that's so interesting about the zero RB conversation is that zero RB was really built for redraft, and it dominates in redraft, or it has through many years. But I think you could certainly go back and look at it and say it was most potent from 2008-ish to 2015-ish, which is, kind of the overlapping time period where, I had talked about the results from the past when I wrote about it 2013. We certainly had this season in 2015 where you had the RB apocalypse. You have that kind of bounce back season for running backs in 2016. And then you had this kind of mini running back golden era where you actually do have running backs who are scoring in that, 22 to 25 point per game range, a range that we, basically didn't see again last season. You think about Saquon Barkley in a season where he has 60-yard touchdown run after 60-yard touchdown run after 60-yard touchdown run, and he's basically just getting to the bottom edge of what we could get during that sort of mini running back golden age. Unfortunately for running back drafters, the backs who were putting up those points did not have the types of careers that guys like Alvin Kamara and Derrick Henry are having, where they've continued to score. And so you had what was more like the McCaffrey scoring, where you had these MVP seasons and then you had a lot of missed seasons. Colm, it still just feels really weird to look back at the last 5 seasons and realize that Christian McCaffrey basically has missed 3 of them, right? The guys that we got during the golden age, they had all of those misses and then they were also done. And so anytime that you drafted them and they got hurt, you lost. And then anytime that you drafted them thinking maybe they'll make a comeback, well, they didn't. So you lost, right? So there were lots of issues in there. It's been interesting. And, since we're probably not going to be drafting a lot of, especially Kamara, you're hoping that his scoring from a fantasy perspective, not anything against him personally, obviously, which is where some of this stuff gets weird because you don't ever want to be rooting against someone's career. But you are hoping that the guys that you draft are able to beat that type of scoring and those scoring levels. I've taken a bit of a detour away from some of the question about the elite tight end. The reason that I bring that up is that it's interesting because zero RB really finally gained widespread acceptance and usage when it was dominating in best ball. There are different reasons that it dominates in best ball than the reasons that it dominates in redraft, but it can certainly dominate in both. But you want to make sure that you're playing the two contests in the ways that they work, because it's not anywhere close to a 1-to-1 overlap in terms of why it works. When we're thinking about zero RB and redraft, and we're thinking about this idea of the elite tight end, for me, and I think this is even more the case now than it's ever been, but it's always one of those things where this has always been the approach. And that's why zero RB as opposed to, say, wide receiver heavy is the key, right? Because the approach does matter. What we're looking for in redraft is this combination of zero RB, zero bad player, which is something that has been sort of a side, meme or concept or what have you, which I think sometimes people think that we disagree with. Like, no, but that's kind of the whole thing of zero RB. Those things go hand in hand, right? Zero bad player, and then an extreme focus on getting power into the starting lineup. And so one of the things I think is a very reasonable way to look at that, and one of the areas that you might tweak your zero RB approach in 2025, is that we are being given so much at the running back position that you probably don't need to do the type of zero RB that would have been helpful and would have worked in the past, where you just ignore running back for a long time. And then you use the talent that you have on your roster to get those RB breakouts. And then you have a starting lineup that is just far superior to everyone else's, but maybe you have to claw back some points because you didn't get a ton of points at the RB positions early in the season. I think especially in FFPC, where you have a 2-2-2 as opposed to a 2-3-1, you have some push in the direction of making sure that your starting line. Oh, and then the other part of that being that you have a vaguely short season. Now, it's not as short because they've added the extra game. And so instead of an 11-week regular season, you have the 12-week regular season. Then 13 and 14 are the
playoffs.
Are the playoffs for the league playoffs. So we have an extra game, but certainly you can't wait until the end of week 13 to make your full run like you could in the NFFC days. You can't wait for week 17 the way that you can in an MFL 10 of death where you have just full season scoring. You think through what the different formats are and what your incentives are, right? But one of the reasons that you would want that elite tight end in redraft is that you will not get that optimization value that you have from having 3 or even 4. I mean, one of the things that I know that there is some discussion out there about this occasionally, but I think that if you have terrible tight ends on your underdog team, then you really want to think about getting to 4. And the flip side problem of that is just that, then you're starting to use a lot of your roster spots. However, if you built it very well, where you get that 6 wide receiver in 8, and you have a really strong set of QBs. And if you're going 2, 6, 6, 4, you can get there because you put the other pieces in place. But when you're staring there at your big gorilla team every week, you do not want to be staring at 4 bad tight ends. You want to be staring at Brock Bowers or George Kittle or Trey McBride. And the whole value of building a team with a ton of talent is that you can make that tight end pick early, and you're not going to be staring at your lineup and also thinking, well, I've got Brock Bowers, I've got the Trey McBride, but my running backs are weak, my wide receivers are weak because I use an early pick at the position. You don't have that because zero RB has given you enough talent that you are actually looking at your roster and thinking, I've got a good wide receiver on the bench that I would like to play, but I simply have too many good players.
The other thing you mentioned there, maybe we'll elaborate. You mentioned about in the environment now, the running back position has given us so much. Is that more so that you're talking about the way that running backs are now priced versus having to pay up in the first 3 rounds? Let's say they're now kind of sprinkled throughout probably the first 6 to 7 rounds, and then the market has become a little bit more efficient in terms of the running backs that are in that range are actually, when you go back to the flex talent chaos part of it, they are players with, the profile and the talent to be willing to draft at that price. Is that kind of what you're leading to there?
Yeah. I think back to that 2013 season, which was one of those lucky ones, right? It was one of those that was very, very favorable, where almost all the teams drafted kind of with the money in the banana stand or the RotoViz template were really good. And one of the things that was successful about that season was that in that 5, 6, 7 round range, especially late in August, you had this rookie in Le'Veon Bell who had gotten hurt and was going to miss the first month. And then as a result, you're able to get him after you've drafted a really strong initial 4, maybe initial 5, maybe an initial 6. Well, and then you go through the season, different things happen. There were lots of different types of breakouts. Obviously, the teams that finished at the very top had a Jamal Charles, kind of like with the GT thing, and then the receivers after that. But you had these teams that were Bell, and then, Zach Stacy was our guy that year from deep. And, people tend to forget about him because sadly he did go away quickly, right? It was a sort of a flash in the pan type of dynamic there. But for that one season, and especially the back end of that season, he scored a ton of points. And so you're able to put together this really strong running back starting lineup with those guys. Think about Le'Veon Bell, who did go on to be an unbelievable superstar. But, coming out of college, you did have these questions. Now, we pushed him really hard. And if you were a dynasty manager who started up your RotoViz subscription at the very beginning, one of the reasons your teams have basically been good forever is that in a season where they were only so-so in terms of how people were looking at them, we were really pushing DeAndre Hopkins and Le'Veon Bell. And when you get generational guys, that's very, very helpful.
Yeah, I was just looking when you mentioned that about Le'Veon Bell. I looked it up. The Pittsburgh Steelers and the Vikings, they're playing in Dublin this year. But they have previously played over the side of the Atlantic, and it was in 2013. The Minnesota Vikings won 34-27, but Shawn, Le'Veon Bell had 2 touchdowns in that game on 16 carries. That was kind of the start of. I was trying to look up as we were recording. I haven't been able to dive into the weeds enough. I don't know if that was the true breakout game, but you were obviously a couple of weeks into the season there, as you mentioned, with the injury. But obviously that launched the team and your teams that season, and many other people's teams if they had drafted Le'Veon Bell in the same way. When we look, though, through, I guess, as we get ready to finish up, the other part I think that people miss on is the...
Well, but Colm, think about him as a good but not great prospect and hurt.
Yeah.
And compare that to the rookie running back prices that we're getting this year on guys that almost everyone agrees are like really, really good. And just the dramatic difference in that. And then you don't even have to take necessarily rookies. The rookies really stand out, but you have, the names with a Chase Brown. Breece Hall is very controversial. I think that he's probably going to underperform, but he's so talented that he could be in the mix for the top 5 next year. You think about a Kenneth Walker, it is so different. And
those guys would all have been in the second, probably the second to late second round, like in 2013. When we go through the evolution, they would have been pushed all the way up there. People would not have let them end up in the 6th round, 5th round.
No chance. And even now, I do think they'll rise, although I've thought that maybe they would rise by now, at least a little bit. It's interesting that the one guy who's really risen was RJ Harvey, and now we'll see what happens with the J.K. Dobbins situation. But again, it's this tricky part of drafters have gotten so much more sophisticated, but that sophistication has also made them risk averse in ways that are probably counterproductive. You have a Genty who is kind of like being the guy who's drafted all the way up there, but then as a result, he's sort of that placeholder for anyone who is going to be risky, or is just saying like, look, there is a rookie up here. Don't tell us that we're not like willing to draft rookies. There's a rookie in the 1st round. But then that gap between him and Hampton and Henderson and Harvey, and then a whole bunch of other players as they continue to come through, really stands out. And Colm, the thing I wanted to sort of throw in, I don't want to get away from the point that you were kind of moving us to here, but when you look at that and you think of how do I win and how do I maximize the starting lineup and how can I continue to evolve and be flexible in my own thinking, right? The FFPC is a 2-2-2, which means that you can play up to 4 running backs. And that may mean that the way to approach it is to create that exposure to either A or even enough, multiple potential elite running backs early. We still have a lot of guys that we like in those single digit rounds at wide receiver. But I think that the temptation is to be like, okay, well, if we're now running back heavy, like if somehow we're now robust running back and we've made this flip, then you're taking these running backs here and then you're going with the wide receivers late and creating this balanced roster. In a redraft, that's not what you're trying to accomplish. Again, we're trying to win the flex, and the guys who are going to be worth drafting in the double-digit rounds are those upside running backs. And if that means that you end up weak at receiver and you hit on running backs, and you've got 4 or 5 or 6 elite running backs, that will work for this format, right? Because the idea is not to say, 0 RB, 0 RB. The idea is to win. And you want to dominate the flex with points, not with some position, with points. And you're going to put as many stars in that starting lineup as you can.
Yeah, and I think I was starting to move into the talent part of the conversation. But when we look at, like, again, what you could, what you couldn't do, I'm just looking at it. We're going to talk about a big gorilla submission from a listener that drafted a 0 RB roster on the show later this week, and kind of go through that to see if the principles are hit and kind of expand on this conversation. But there's a team in that, for example, out of the second spot that has Bucky Irvin, Chase Brown, Chuba Hubbard, Kenneth Walker, from rounds 2 through 5, and also has CD Lamb up top. But again, kind of what we're talking about there, you couldn't have put that team together with those 4 running backs, 10 years ago, based on what your expectations are. So that's another part of the evolution. That Le'Veon Bell conversation, Shawn, that was, I never realized that was the first game that Le'Veon Bell played in the NFL. So never knew I was at that particular occasion. But moving in then to the talent part, you kind of covered it there in terms of like the talent available in the back half of the round and the profiles. I do think that's an area where people do make some misconceptions or make some errors, is like also pairing into that. It doesn't have to be that it's always an older player, but a player that's deemed as like, this player has a floor and then that other player is unproven, for example, or that other player has these red flags, and like passing up the potential upside player for the potential floor. And I do think, like, especially when we look in the double digit rounds, either in best ball or in redraft for this particular matter, like when you finish your season in a redraft season, like a lot of the players that you draft from rounds 12 onwards, like at some point you're going to cycle through those guys on the roster probably. And people are always afraid of like, well, this is a pick that I have to make sure that it'll stay on the roster. But sometimes then those guys you're holding on to are like, just become roster cloggers. The talent and the profile part of it, I think, gets missed out on. And particularly if somebody did draft a 0 RB or a hero RB roster and then looking at like, well, I've skipped the position to this point. Now I need some like safety. And I think kind of embracing like I think safe is a word that has very different meanings to different people. For us, like safe might be like embracing the upside of the risk, whereas some people, the safe is going to be the part that like anchors them to the bottom of the standings at the end of the season.
Blair always likes to say that one of the reasons that he drafts 0 RB is because it's actually the safe strategy. But the safe strategy has to be executed aggressively in order to have that. And I mean, you explained it perfectly there, where redraft and best ball have some different dynamics in those double digit rounds. You want to be careful that you don't sort of split how you're looking at it so completely that in best ball, you're not taking any risks, and in redraft, you're only taking wild risks. But understanding that those guys are going to stay on your roster in best ball is important. And so you do care about how you're creating exposure to touches. And it's not even necessarily so much about being
I guess it's the
risk
week
averse,
one.
but understanding the complete holes, or the guys who are extremely likely to be complete holes. I mean, one of the reasons that you might prefer a Keaton Mitchell to some of these rookies in best ball is simply that even though the projections for Keaton Mitchell are very low, I mean, what are the chances that Keaton Mitchell, probably recovered, doesn't have a handful of games where the Ravens are winning easily enough that he plays a substantial number of snaps, and that in some of those games he doesn't hit on just the overall volume you need and or long touchdowns, right? So even though the chance of Keaton Mitchell beating out a Derrick Henry is essentially zero, the odds that he has a huge season are not particularly high. A lot of these rookies, the odds are actually very, very high. But like a Brashard Smith, right? His chances of being just a pure hole are pretty high. And you want to be aware of that in best ball. I mean, redraft, it's a completely different story. And you're working through those things. But in either formulation, right? Even in the best ball one, you want guys like Keaton Mitchell, guys who have a ton of talent.
And again, going through that, like, the likes of, Nick Chubb, like, again, somebody who people will be familiar with a name. The name may feel, oh, yeah, there's a safety or a security to that. But then, that's the week 1, week 2, week 3 projection is looking at longer part. You mentioned the rookies earlier. Often with the rookies, they're going to come on as the season goes along. But I think we've covered quite a few of the areas. The other area that we didn't get into this conversation, but we are going to talk about in the other show, because the team that was submitted to us did draft Jaden Daniels in the 3rd round. So we will get into some of that elite QB conversation and how that fits in, particularly with this being the big gorilla. It's going to be a redraft format, and we'll talk about how that would work in redraft or best ball. But that is where we're going to finish up this particular conversation. We probably could continue to go on for multiple hours on the topic, but we'll try and finish it up there. Shawn, anything to add before we finish up, or will we save all that for the next edition?
No, I'm fired up about that one. I think anybody who is wanting to get out and draft a big gorilla before then and is a new user to FFPC, if you use the code 25 RotoViz, you can get $25 off of the first team. You have to actually play a team. You get $25 off. That is always helpful. Colm, that will buy you 1.5 trips to Chipotle, which is always nice.
Chipotle, Shawn, springing up some locations over here as well. I believe they're all in Northern Ireland, but that's close enough for me. Haven't taken the trip in. Would you recommend it?
Oh, it's fantastic. But if you're going to get guac on your burrito, make sure you bring your pocketbook. Anybody who is looking forward to playing that, and if that code doesn't work for whatever reason, we have the codes in a lot of the articles, including some of my big gorilla articles. You can find that. You can get over there and join in with the FFPC. It's a fantastic contest. Again, always make sure that it fits in with your overall plan. But yeah, we're looking forward to an OT listener, an OT community member winning the $1 million in the big gorilla this year. And as you mentioned, I mean, this team that has been sent to us, one of the reasons we love these reader submissions is that they often do create the perfect framework for discussions we wanted to have anyway. So yeah. It's going to be exciting.
So it's a team from the 101. So it's a 0RB team from the 101 we'll be talking about in the show later this week. Make sure you subscribe to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get that once it is available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on social media at Overtime Ireland. You can check all of Shawn's work, including the original 0RB piece, up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.